Hello, gentle listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions, the fortnightly podcast that brings you dark tales, both old and new, performed by your humble narrator, Kristen Holland. As you've probably already gleaned from our trailer clip we released a few days ago, this episode will be looking to the stars as the source for our discomfort. What do you mean you haven't seen it? We put trailer clips up on our Instagram page for every show, you know. If you haven't started following us yet, then snap to it at Nocturnal Transmissions on Instagram. It's very simple. Or you could just keep abreast of developments through our Facebook page, I suppose, if that's more your speed. Anyway, I don't wish to spend this entire episode browbeating you, gentle listener. Oh no, I think the content of this little story will be punishment enough for anyone not yet patronizing our social media presence. So, without further ado, Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present W.B. Stickles, The Lunch Pail. "All right," Mr. Martin said as he handed out the last batch of quizzes. "This one's a bit of a doozy, so I hope everyone did their reading assignment last night." He eyed his students momentarily before returning to his desk at the head of the class. "Watch out for question 5 in particular," he added. "The earlier classes all stumbled with that one." They were in the middle of dissecting Orwell's Animal Farm, one of Mr. Martin's all-time favorites. The question he mentioned centered on how Napoleon had expressed his contempt for Snowball's windmill plans. Despite his having foot-stomped the answer, it was still the highest-missed question of the day. Thinking of ways to fix it, he glanced back at the clock mounted above the room's massive whiteboard. "It's currently 1:30, he said. "You have until 1:45 to complete your quiz. Get to it." The room erupted with a flurry of quiz sheets being flipped over, then retreated into silence. Out of habit, Mr. Martin did a perfunctory scan of the class to ensure they were all aptly engaged in the task at hand. By and large, they all were, with two mildly surprising exceptions. The first was Mike Goldman, who just sat there, gazing at his quiz with a pained expression. The other was Kevin Dunlop, who for some damnable reason had decided to stare up at the ceiling instead of down at his desk. Bemused, Mr. Martin folded his arms across his chest and gave them a few moments to find their focus. After about 10 seconds, Mike Goldman hesitantly picked up his pen and began answering the 5 essay questions. Kevin Dunlop, on the other hand, kept his attention trained on the ceiling. Mr. Martin took in a breath, harnessing his patience. "Everything okay, Kev?" he said, drawing looks from the other students. "I'm fairly certain none of the answers are up there." Kevin's eyes ticked toward Mr. Martin briefly before darting back to the ceiling. "Oh, no, Mr. M," he said in an airy tone. "They're all up there." "Are they now?" Mr. Martin said. "Yes, sirree." Mr. Martin took in another harnessing breath and surveyed the bone-white ceiling tiles. "Strange. I don't see anything." "No," Kevin said. "But you will." Unsure of what to make of that, Mr. Martin adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and straightened his purple instructor's blazer. "Good to know, Kev, but as you're aware, we're taking a quiz right now, so knock off whatever this is and get back to work." The boy's eyes ticked back to Mr. Martin, and a strange grin materialized on his face. "I have a better idea, Mr. M," he said, lifting his hands in the air. "Watch." His hands kept rising, floating above his head like weather balloons. When they could go no higher, Kevin levered his wrists forward and crooked his fingers, giving him the impression of an old-timey magician about to perform some grand illusion. Mr. Martin frowned. His patience vanished. "Kevin," he said, "I don't know what's gotten into you today, but if you keep this up—" Before he could finish the thought, Kevin slammed his palms down hard against his desk's laminate surface, producing a thunderclap that drew a smattering of gasps from around the room. "No stopping it now!" he brayed, slapping the desk again. In the next instant, he was on his feet, plucking a textbook from the tray beneath Susie Stanton's desk. "Hey!" Susie exclaimed. "Put that back!" Kevin smiled at her, almost sympathetically, then commenced ripping pages from the book and tossing them into the air. "Doesn't matter," he told her quickly, repeating the rip-toss process several more times. Pages flittered in the air, and within seconds the classroom resembled a shaken snow globe. "Not one bit." Mr. Martin watched it all unfold in a state of mute astonishment. In his 7+ years teaching at Hawkins, he'd never experienced anything like this. In truth, aside from a couple of half-hearted verbal spats that fizzled out on their own, he'd had a rather peaceful tenure at the academy. Quite the antithesis to the 5 years he'd spent at Audubon Middle School in L.A., where conflict was part of his daily existence. "Mr. Martin, make him stop!" The shrill plea, issued from Lily Leprario's pinched jowls, jolted Mr. Martin back to the here and now. "Shit," he thought, popping up from his seat. "I'm losing the room." At Hawkins, losing control of one's room was cardinal sin number 2, right behind inappropriate touching of students. Both fireable offenses. Having no desire to lose his job over this nonsense, Mr. Martin vaulted out of his seat and summoned all the fire and brimstone he could muster. "Mr. Dunlop!" he bellowed. "Stop that at once!" His words resonated through the room, bringing everything to an abrupt halt. Kevin froze mid-page rip, while everyone else snapped to like soldiers told to 10 hut. Pleased the tactic worked, but eager to press the advantage, Mr. Martin pointed to the classroom's sole door and said, "Out! Now!" "Yeah," Susie Stanton said, her face twisted with rage. "Get out!" Kevin blinked at her. A whirl of genuine confusion eddied in his eyes. He glanced at the textbook. "You don't understand. You haven't seen it. Mr. Martin cut him off. "Kevin, I gave you an instruction and I expect you to follow it. If you don't, we're going to have a much bigger problem." Kevin considered this and offered a solemn nod. "Yes, sir," he said, his confusion clearly deepening. He turned to his left and shifted his attention to Ethan Kellogg, who sat in the desk directly behind his. Ethan, the newest Hawkins enrollee, stared straight ahead, offering no sign that he was even aware of Kevin's presence. "Show them," Kevin pleaded, gesturing toward the metal lunch pail perched between Ethan's feet like a faithful dog. "Leave him alone." It was Celia Williams this time. Celia and Susie were BFFs, and Mr. Martin was fairly certain that she and Kevin had dated sometime in the past. Just do what Mr. Martin said and go before you get in more trouble. Kevin ignored her and waited for Ethan to respond. Ethan just kept staring ahead, as if lost in a trance. "Last warning," Mr. Martin growled. Seeing he wasn't going to get what he wanted from the new kid, Kevin slumped his shoulders, dropped Susie's ruined textbook, and slowly made his way to the door. "Good luck, dumbass," Mike Goldman said as Kevin shuffled by. The two were teammates on the lacrosse team. "Too late for that," Kevin replied, and exited the room. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, Susie eased out of her desk and set to work gathering up the scattered pages. "What an asshole," she grumbled to herself. Nick Ashton got up to help her. Mr. Martin removed his glasses and massaged the bridge of his nose. "Thanks, guys," he said. He slid the glasses back on and addressed the classroom as a whole. "Look, I don't know what's going on with Kevin, but I promise I'll get it sorted. In the meantime, please finish your quizzes. Don't worry, the grade won't count. I don't imagine I'll be long." Hoping that was true, Mr. Martin collected what remained of his wits and went to deal with the boy. According to the Academy's official brochure, the architect behind Hawkins's impressive structures had been obsessed with neoclassical design. During his first tour of the campus, Mr. Martin saw evidence of this everywhere he looked. Every building, every courtyard, every corridor was infused with either Baroque or Gothic arrangements, often both. It wasn't quite Hogwarts, but it wasn't far off either. Out of all of it, Mr. Martin was most enthralled by the tall atrium-style windows that capped all of the building's second-story passageways. On cloudless days, the windows allowed in oceans of natural sunlight, making the Forsythia walls and ochre linoleum appear as if they were on fire. He found Kevin standing beneath one such window, eyes closed, face upturned, to soak in the afternoon sun. Mr. Martin approached the boy cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "Okay, bud, let's have it. What's this all about?" "About?" Kevin echoed. "Oh, nothing. And everything. It's all the same, you know." His voice had a strange quality to it. "No," Mr. Martin replied. "I don't know. Why don't you explain it to me?" Kevin shrugged, the intense sunlight shimmering wildly off his curly black hair. "Can't," he said. "It's just something you have to see. Like this." He opened his eyes, stripped off his blue student's blazer and casually dropped it onto the floor, an act tantamount to flag burning at Hawkins. "See?" Mr. Martin stared in disbelief. "Kevin," he said, "have you lost your mind?" Kevin shook his head. "I'm trying to show you," he said, and began stamping his feet all over the esteemed garment. "See it now?" A ragged giggle surfaced in his throat, then burst from his mouth like staccato gunfire. Listening to it echo through the large hallway, which had always boasted great acoustics, a discouraging notion crossed Mr. Martin's mind. What if this was something bigger than a garden variety tantrum? What if the kid really had blown a mental gasket? If so, Mr. Martin followed that thread to its inevitable conclusion, and his heart sank a little further in his chest. By rule, all suspected mental episodes had to be reported up the chain, and once that happened, administration was required to make a determination about the student's future at the school. While such episodes were rare at Hawkins, the ones Mr. Martin knew of all met unfavorable outcomes, which meant it was very likely that Kevin's time at the academy was over. Mr. Martin let out a long sigh. "Ah, Kevin," he said, "please stop, so that we can take a walk downstairs. See Mrs. Skelly." Mrs. Skelly was the school's head counselor. To his great surprise, the boy actually stopped. At once, his legs quit pistoning, his feet went still, and he sort of just sagged there like a deactivated robot. Across the hall, a door creaked open. "Everything okay, Bill?" a voice inquired. Mr. Martin turned to find Mr. Hawthorne's hulking form poised in the opposite classroom's doorway, his caramel-brown eyes surveying Kevin's odd stance. "Mike," Mr. Martin said, relieved to see the man. "Yeah, not really." He explained what had transpired and asked Mr. Hawthorne to keep an eye on his class while he escorted Kevin down to administration. "Sure, Bill, sure," Mr. Hawthorne said. "Take your time." "Thanks," Mr. Martin said, patting Mr. Hawthorne's brawny shoulder. Of all the people he worked with at Hawkins, Mr. Hawthorne was the only one he considered a friend. "Well, let me update my students, get them working on something, then I'll take him down." "Sounds good," Mr. Hawthorne said, picking up the discarded blazer. "Here." Kevin merely smirked at him. "No, thanks," the boy said. "I don't need it anymore." After assigning his own students an extra sheet of linear functions, Mr. Hawthorne slipped out of his classroom and plodded across the hall to Mr. Martin's room. "Sorry, Kev," he said, thinking how unfair the universe was sometimes. Kevin was a good kid, academically sound, perpetually bright and happy, always courteous and respectful, a kid thriving in the prime of his adolescence. A mental break like this just wasn't fair. Wishing the kid well, he grasped the room's door handle and began to lever it open. As he did, a distinctly feminine voice bleated out, "Just show us already," from somewhere behind the door. Startled, Mr. Hawthorne loosened his grip on the handle and listened for a moment. More words came from the feminine voice and from other students, but he was only able to make out little snippets. Abruptly curious to know what he was walking into, Mr. Hawthorne glanced up at the small intercom panel mounted next to the door. The panel, a fixture among all Hawkins classrooms, allowed authorized faculty members to listen in on a teaching session without disturbing the teacher conducting it. As a senior staff member, Mr. Hawthorne had a code for the panel, though he'd never actually had a reason to use it before. Figuring this was as good a time as any, he punched in his code and pressed the little red "Listen" button. At first, all he heard was silence. Then Susie Stanton's voice leapt from the device's little speaker. "Oh, what's in there already?" she said. "A gift," came a boy's reply. "From my dad. He was kind of famous. Tom Kellogg." Murmurs rippled through the room, but no one said they were familiar with the name. Mr. Hawthorne recognized it, though, and deduced the reply had come from Ethan Kellogg. "Doesn't matter," Ethan said. "All that matters is this." There was a faint creaking sound. "He left it in my room the night he went away." Mr. Hawthorne disengaged the intercom His normally serious countenance softened. Like most news-watching Americans, he knew the Kellogg boy's story well. Such tragedy, such heartache. Was it possible the kid had chosen this quiet moment to talk about what he'd been through, after only a couple of days being around this particular group of kids? If so, it was a pretty momentous deal. Deciding to give the boy a chance to say his piece, the big man strolled down to the end of the hall and gradually made his way back, allowing 2 full minutes to elapse. This time, when he got to the door, he went right in. Principal Hume sat back in her leather chair and pondered everything Mr. Martin had just told her. "And you have no inkling what set the boy off?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Mr. Martin replied. The principal looked at her computer's flat screen and reviewed Kevin Dunlop's personal file. "As you're no doubt aware, Mr. Dunlop's conduct warrants immediate expulsion. Investigation to follow. I'll have to call his parents and have them arrange for someone to come fetch him." She went to reach for a desk phone, but withdrew her hand and touched a finger to her lips. "Out of curiosity, Bill, you currently have Ethan Kellogg in your classroom, correct?" "Correct." "Had he any interaction with Kevin at any time before Kevin's outburst?" Mr. Martin ran the last 2 days in his head. As far as he recalled, Ethan had been mouse-quiet the entire time, never raising his hand and only giving the tersest of replies when called upon. Mostly he just sat there gazing ahead, or staring down at that old metal lunch pail of his, the one with NASA embossed on the lid. "I don't believe so. Why?" "Not sure," said Principal Hume. "It's just, I got a funny feeling from the boy when his aunt enrolled him on Tuesday. She seemed a bit off, too, come to think of it. Babbled a lot. Quirky as hell. Understandable, given the circumstances," Mr. Martin said. 3 months earlier, Ethan's father, the celebrated astronaut, Major Tom Kellogg, had murdered Ethan's mother in the middle of the night, then put a shotgun in his own mouth and pulled the trigger. According to various news agencies, the elder Kellogg had carried out the last part in Ethan's bedroom, while Ethan was awake to see it all. "True enough," the principal agreed. "But I've seen my share of traumatized kids, and what I saw in Ethan's eyes, well, it raised a flag, you know. The principal at Briar Hills mentioned something similar when I spoke to him prior to Ethan's transfer. Nothing concrete, just an impression he'd gotten. After the disturbance with the other students, he said he wished he'd acted on it." Mr. Martin arched an eyebrow. While he wasn't privy to the details, he'd heard a little bit about what had transpired at the other school. The suicide, and something about students attacking other students. "What exactly did you see?" he asked. "I don't know. I guess you'd say it was a sort of a calculating." Her expression was cut short by a scream from the office next to hers. "Oh, no! Kevin! Somebody help!" It was Mrs. Skelly. Mr. Martin and Principal Hume both shot up out of their chairs and scrambled into the counselor's office. They found the rail-thin woman stooped over a sprawled-out Kevin Dunlop, her bony hands held out toward the boy, but not actually touching him. Spots of red stained her tawny skirt. Mr. Martin edged in beside her to get a better look at Kevin. A move he regretted the instant he saw the pencils. "Oh, God!" he said. Tears streamed down the counselor's pale cheeks. "They were on the desk. I was just trying to get him to talk to me when he grabbed them and did that." Mr. Mr. Martin knelt over the boy and examined the injuries. The number 2 pencils were buried an inch deep in the kid's eyeballs, their eraser ends sticking out like arrow fletchings. There was blood, but less of it than Mr. Martin would have expected. Mr. Martin put his hand on Kevin's chest. The boy had a heartbeat, and he was still breathing. Principal Hume snatched Mrs. Skelly's phone and dialed campus security. After relaying what had occurred, she set the receiver down and peered at Kevin. The boy, coming back to consciousness, whooped and clapped his hands clumsily, reminding Mr. Martin of one of the autistic kids he had worked with at Audubon, Damon Greeley, who whooped and clapped like that whenever he saw pictures of golden retrievers. "It doesn't help!" Kevin brayed, clapping again and again. Drool oozed from his mouth and piss blossomed down his pant leg. "No, sir! Doesn't help at all!" Climbing the stairs to the second floor 10 minutes later, Mr. Martin pondered what to say to his students about their troubled classmate. The truth was likely the best option, though he'd have to edit out the grislier parts. Whatever he decided, he'd have to make it quick. The police and emergency services were on the way, as were Kevin's parents, and Principal Hume wanted him back down to her office before everyone arrived. As he reached the top of the stairwell, his musings took an unexpected detour, and he found himself deliberating how nice, how utterly goddamn resplendent it would be to stop by Haverty's later and knock back a few shots of Jaeger. He would do no such thing, of course, because doing so would end his 5-month stint on the wagon, and it would destroy his chances of getting his family back, something he'd been working at for over a year now. No, after work he would drive straight home, pop open a can of A&W and fall asleep in front of the TV. Like a responsible adult. "Stay on task, dummy," he told himself as he exited the stairwell. "They need you." And at present, his students needed him even more. They needed his strength and assurance, and he couldn't let them down. He crossed the hall to his door, cleared his throat, and entered the bedlam that used to be his classroom. Having grown up in a house run by alcoholic slobs, Mr. Martin knew a thing or two about untidiness. As a means of coping with the squalor of his childhood environs, he'd cultivated an unusual passion for cleaning at an early age. Crossing into adulthood, that passion had burgeoned into an OCD-level obsession, as evidenced in the pristine condition in which he kept his classroom. When he'd left to bring Kevin down to administration, the room had been relatively shipshape, save for the pages Kevin had ripped from Susie's textbook. What lay before him now, however, scarcely resembled that room. Desks and cabinets were scattered everywhere, some upside down, others tipped onto their sides. Windows were smashed, their blinds pulled down and plucked apart. Across the floor, masses of folders, books, and paper were strewn like scholastic confetti, and strange red symbols adorned the room's earth-tone walls. His brain processed all of this in a matter of seconds before moving on to the far more disturbing issue of the students themselves. Of the 15 he'd left in Mr. Hawthorne's care, 8 were currently loping about the room like feral monkeys, cooing and cawing and attacking anything that struck their fancy, including each other. 3 others, Nick Ashton, Mike Goldblum, and Lily Leprario, had meanwhile taken to painting the class's walls with red-tipped fingers. Each babbled incessantly as they created their strange art, their tongues spewing rabid streams of gibberish. doesn't last long," Lily Loprario mewled as she scampered over to Max Hoffman's body, which lay prostrate beneath the classroom's whiteboard. When she got to the dead boy, she went down on her haunches and jammed her hand into the pulsing gash that used to be Max's throat, re-tipping her fingers in the crimson paint. At the back of the room, Susie Stanton and Celia Williams were no better off. The two girls stood facing each other, exchanging fierce headbutts. Thwack! 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 Judging by how bloody and misshapen their faces were, Mr. Martin reckoned they'd been at it a while. Then there was Ethan Kellogg. Unlike his classmates, Ethan had elected to remain seated at his desk. He bore a placid expression and sat with his hands perched atop his lunch pail. Taking note of the fact that Mr. Martin was looking at him, the boy opened the pail's lid and made a beckoning motion. "You ought to look, Bill," Mr. Hawthorne said from somewhere to Mr. Martin's left. Mr. Martin jerked his head in that direction and was alarmed to discover his friend lurking in the classroom storage closet, shirtless and crouching over a much smaller woman. "Mike?" Mr. Martin nodded. Mr. Hawthorne gave a slight tick of the head, but did not take his gaze off the woman trapped beneath him. Mr. Martin couldn't see the woman's face, buried as it was in a pool of blood, but he noticed the frizzy grey hair and liver-spotted hands, and deduced that it was Miss Stansbury from down the hall. Why Mr. Hawthorne would be crouching over the crotchety old bat like that was beyond his comprehension. "Jesus, man," he quavered. "What the hell are you doing?" Seeming not to hear, Mr. Hawthorne grabbed a handful of grey hair and yanked upward, revealing a red mass of muscle and bone where the woman's face should have been. Mr. Martin gasped and stumbled back into the classroom's door. Mr. Hawthorne's eyes at last drifted up from his quarry and found Mr. Martin. "Wanted to see what lay behind the mask," he said. "Always thought Judith would be ugly on the inside, too." On the floor in front of the dead woman lay a pair of yellow-handled scissors, the same kind Mr. Martin kept in his desk drawer. Mr. Hawthorne leaned over, snatched the scissors, and jammed them into the side of the woman's head. "Wrong this whole time, Bill," Mr. Hawthorne said with the tenor of someone talking about global warming or the A's chances of winning the pennant. The big man rose to his full height, released Miss Stansbury's lifeless body, and faced Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin retreated a step. His instincts screamed for him to flee as fast as he could. Heeding the impulse, Mr. Martin ripped open the door and bolted into the hallway. An instant later, his shirtless colleague exploded from the room and came barreling after him. Mr. Martin made a scared bleating noise and darted for the stairwell. If he could just get to the stairs, he might have a chance. A far superior physical specimen, Mr. Hawthorne closed the gap between them in seconds. By the time Mr. Martin thought to cry out again, Mr. Hawthorne's strong arms had him in a fierce bear hug and was pulling him back down the hall. "You gotta see it, Bill," the big man said, squeezing hard. "It's a real kick in the pants." Mr. Martin thrashed and kicked, putting everything he had into breaking free. But his friend was too strong. "Mike!" Mr. Martin wheezed. "Why are you doing this?" Mr. Hawthorne squeezed harder, forcing the air from Mr. Martin's lungs. Mr. Martin's legs buckled, and he felt his strength draining from him. A constellation of black spots dotted his vision. Before he knew it, the two of them were back in his classroom. "Right this way," Mr. Hawthorne said, dragging him towards Ethan Kellogg's desk. Ethan watched them approach, a faint spark of interest glimmering in his eyes. As they drew within a few feet, Mr. Hawthorne forced Mr. Martin to his knees. "Hiya, Mr. Martin," Ethan said. On the desk in front of him sat the NASA lunch pail. Mr. Martin tried to stand up, but Mr. Hawthorne was an immovable force, his grip ironclad. Ethan placed his hands on either side of the pail and slid it forward. Its lid was still open. "Look." Mr. Martin attempted to resist, every iota of his being telling him not to look. But something about the pail, some intangible magnetism, pulled his gaze toward the metal box. And he looked. Initially, he wasn't quite sure what lay within. An object of some sort. An irregular black ball. Something akin to a piece of coal. "What?" Mr. Martin said. Then his eyes shifted focus, and the ball undulated, seemingly collapsing in on itself, its essence there and not there. As it did, he felt a pleasant click in his mind, felt himself drawn in, felt his entire psyche slip into its onyx depths. It was a keyhole, he knew, a pinprick portal through which everything existed, the beginning and the end, the expanse's totality, and the void beyond, the entire construct unfurled. It was the enormity of hope and the magnitude of failure, the creation things grand and utter disappointment. It was a tiny glimpse of entropy and unraveling, the slate being wiped clean. Mr. Martin experienced this all, the eons and the minutiae, in a blink. In that incalculable span, he came to understand his existence and the existence of all living things. And he laughed out loud, for it was wondrous and tragic and unimaginably funny. He stood, and Mr. Hawthorne gave him some space. "Ain't that a hoot?" the big man said. Mr. Martin beamed up at him. "A hoot," he said. "I'll say." Mr. Hawthorne guffawed at that and meandered over to the windows, where he retrieved a shard of broken glass. Mr. Martin resumed surveying the room. His gaze moved from bloodied teenager to bloodied teenager, before landing on Miss Stansbury's body, specifically the scissors jutting from her head. He so wanted to bury them in his own head, to disrupt the vile truths buzzing about his neurons. It was too much. Too much. The notion cycled over and over in his head, each pass stripping away another layer of his consciousness. Soon he no longer cared about himself, his family, or the world at large.
"Excuse me, Mike,"
he said.
"There's something I need to borrow from Judith."
Ethan Kellogg closed his lunch pail, got up and moseyed out into the hallway. Across the broad corridor, the door to Mr. Hawthorne's classroom stood open. A number of Mr. Hawthorne's students were gathered at the threshold, drawn from their seats by the sounds emanating from Mr. Martin's room. Ethan eased his way through the group and headed for Mr. Hawthorne's desk. "What's going on out there?" a tall, blond boy inquired fretfully. "What's all that noise?" Ethan set the pail on Mr. Hawthorne's desk.
"Want to see something neat?"
he said. The blond boy sneered. "Huh?"
"It's from space,"
Ethan said, scrutinizing the rest of the students. Several perked up at the mention of space and gravitated toward Ethan. The others hesitated, torn between their compulsion to know what was going on across the hall and their curiosity regarding the pail's contents. Eventually, curiosity won out, and the rest joined their more decisive classmates.
"Anyone heard of T-168?
Ethan asked as they gathered around him. A short, red-haired girl with a billion freckles said she had.
"It's an asteroid, right? Didn't a space shuttle fly up to it a couple months ago?"
She went quiet and squinted at Ethan. Vague recognition glinted in her eyes.
"Wait, you're him, aren't you? The new boy whose daddy was on the shuttle?"
Ethan nodded and touched the lunch pail.
"He found it, up there, half embedded in a chunk of palladium ore. He said there are others, but he felt a connection with this one. So he collected it in a sample container and snuck it aboard. See how it moves?"
Ethan nudged the thing and it bobbed sluggishly about the pail's interior before settling back in the center.
"His first night home, he came to my room. He was different. I could see it. He told me about what he found, said it needed to be shared with everyone, but he couldn't be the one to do it. His mind was too fragile. I didn't understand. He said it was okay and showed me. But just a quick peek. Enough to see, but still show others. Because everyone needs to know."
"You're talking nonsense," the red-haired girl said.
"What is it already?"
Ethan opened the lid.
"One of many to come," he said. "A couple decades may seem like a long time, but it's not."
He beckoned them forward. One by one they came, each taking their turn and wandering away. Some stayed within the room, frothing and keening and caving in on themselves. Others went out into the hallway, eager to spread the inglorious word. After the last of them had had their fill, Ethan closed the pail's lid and exited the room. As he stepped past a pair of students locked in a contest to see who could pull the other's tongue out first, he mused how much better it was going this time around compared to the previous time at the other school. In the distance, sirens had begun to shriek. Ethan registered this with a wan smile and started down the hall towards Miss Stansbury's room. The Lunch Pail by W.B. Stickle. Mr. Stickle lives in central New York with his wife and 3 kids. By day, he works for the Air Force, no less, as a systems administrator, doing computer geek stuff. By night, he reads and writes as much as life allows. He has published over a dozen stories in various magazines and anthologies, including Sanitarium magazine, E-Fiction Horror, Shadows of the Mind, SQ Mag, and the Lovecraftian tribute, Whispers from the Abyss. Now, let's welcome our new Patreon acolytes, shall we? Who are our latest true believers? Gerald Harris, Nicoteo, Drain Bamage, and Set. Welcome, Gerald, Nika, Drain, and Set. Don't forget to send me a picture if you'd like it included on your digital membership card. Not you, of course, Nika. You're well ahead of the curve, my dear. Now, before we sign off, just a quick heads up. Next episode, which is a Patreon subscriber exclusive episode, we will be featuring at long last one of our most requested stories. That's all I'm going to say for now. If you'd like to find out what that story is going to be ahead of time, well, you'll just have to follow us on Instagram, won't you? This episode was brought to you with the generous assistance of our Patreon subscribers. A particular thank you goes out to our esteemed cohorts: Stephen Andrews, Joe Stinson, Wayne Prince, Abaddon, Amy Clausen, Adam, J.B., Rachel Brown, Alex Brewers, Stephanie Saloka, Michael Wood, Evan Dooley, Sam Bell, Robert Troy Hampton Peterson, Eugene Petrie, and Alicia Townsend. All non-public domain stories are featured with the permission of the authors. All voices and production are concocted by Kristen Holland. Until next time, as always, watch the skies, fear the dark, and don't trust anyone. Especially yourself. Good night, gentle listener.